I wanted to talk tonight about what we've learned about peak performance, about how our brain works, about how mindfulness comes into that. The stuff that is being used every day in the sports world and by some of the big executives, because it's become so empirically tested that we know that it works. If you look at the old paradigm is multitasking, where we do a whole lot of things at one time. And we're never really completely absorbed in the one thing that we're doing. Well, the research has shown that there really is no such thing as multitasking. And what they found is that this is how the brain works. The brain is very linear, and it does not do multiple things at the same time. It just feels like it is because it's happening so quickly. The new paradigm, and this has been studied in several decades at Florida State University and also all over the place. You see it's really come out in a sport like golf, because golf is not a reactionary sport. It's a sport where somebody's not throwing a ball at you or hitting a ball at you. Basically, the ball just sits there and waits for you to do something. And this lets the mind become very interfering with the process. So they realized that they had to understand this better to find out how to get the mind to stay in one place at one time. Because what generally happens is, if you're right-handed, is that the left side of the brain teaches the mind how to do something, and then the left brain needs to shut up and get out of the way and let the intuitive side take over. This is particularly true in any kind of a hand-eye coordination thing. But the left brain is very dominant, and it doesn't want to do that. So they had to find ways of tricking this to happen. And what they have found is, through a whole bunch of series, and I apologize, this is something I usually talk about 3 hours about, and so I've had to kind of just pick stuff out that I thought would make it somewhat interesting in like a 20-minute talk. But what we have found, the bottom line is that when we have a quiet mind, if you look at people that are operating at their top efficiency and their peak performance, if you take an athlete, a golfer who's winning the tournament, walking down the 18th green on Sunday afternoon, their mind is very quiet, their eyes are very still. There are certain characteristics that they exhibit. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to get to that point in our work and in everything that we do, because that is when we are functioning at the highest level. It's when we're exhibiting or exerting the least amount of effort in the least amount of time to develop the skill or to accomplish whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. Actually, one of my daughters is a teacher in the kindergarten, and she said it's very documented now that the kids that are coming up have almost no attention span. And it's really a struggle because they're so used to everything being so instantaneous. So on the one hand, it's a good thing because our brains they're speeding up and they're able to do more in less time. But on the other one, we want to stop and focus on one thing. The brain doesn't want to obey that. It wants to keep moving. And so we ask ourselves, well, then how do we reverse this? Because it'd be nice if we could have both of these attributes. And there really isn't any other way to do it but some form of what I will call stillness. You can, if you don't like the word meditation, you can call it thought awareness training. It really doesn't matter what you call it, but what we have to start doing is teaching our minds how to be still. Because our mind is forgetting how to do that. So I'm not going to do this tonight, but generally what I have people do is to sit. I just say, we're going to sit here for 2 minutes. I want everybody to just shut your eyes and stop thinking. Well, obviously what happens is that you can't do it. And for many people, it's the first time that they realize that their mind is a thought machine. That's what the mind was designed to do. It thinks. And if you don't give it something to think about, it will find something on its own. It's always in search mode. So what happens for people, generally speaking, is their mind runs around during the day. It's just never where they're at. And so there's very little of their energy that's actually going into what they're doing. And their mind is creating thoughts. And when you sit down and you try to stop your mind from thinking, you become aware of how many thoughts that it's actually creating and how little control you have over it. what it tells us is that this present moment awareness, this present moment functioning, this mindfulness is how that's what we can call being in the zone. It's just very important. And if you want to function at the top of your game, you're going to have to learn how to do that. And the first thing you have to do is learn when you're not doing it. And I think that it helps when you begin to understand how the whole relationship of practicing, practice, everything we do is practice. We learn to walk, we learn to talk, all those things we were practicing, we just didn't really know that we were practicing it. But we understand now that, repetition with intention creates the skill. And you can experience that period of time as either something pleasurable or it can be this nuisance that you have to go through. And I remember one day I ended up sitting at one of these school bus stops, and they were teaching this senior citizen how to be a school crossing guard. And at the time it was really amusing because this guy was clearly over his head with the instructions that were being given to him. He had the whistle in his mouth, and I could see the woman on the side who was somewhat skilled at this was teaching him, you have to do this and you have to stop the cars and then you tell the buses to go. And watching this guy, he was so clumsy at it, it was like, it was like, beep, 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 all this hand motion and the whistle was going. And what was so interesting about this was about 3 weeks later, I came up on the same intersection. And this guy had been transformed from Barney Fife into Morpheus. It was like, now the whistle's hanging out of here, and it just, occasionally, he just goes beep. And he didn't turn around to the cars, he just put his hand. It was like, don't make me turn around. And I thought, how did he go from what I saw 3 weeks ago to here? Well, it was practice. The concept of practice really fascinates me because you can learn any skill through deliberate repetition. Because everything that we do is a habit, and the brain creates these synapses and these pathways through the repetition. And if you understand that it takes a certain amount of time for that to happen, then you stop trying to make it happen faster than it can happen. And you experience that time in a very different way. I remember one time when I was younger, I was trying to learn how to play this jazz riff on the piano, and I just kept playing and playing and playing. I just couldn't do it. Every time I did it, I just messed it up. So I finally quit. I just said, I can't do it. It's beyond my ability. I'm just not going to be able to do it. And I stopped. And about 2 weeks later, I was playing on a job, and for whatever reason, I just thought of putting that line in, and I could play it. It was effortless. And I was floored. I thought, how did that happen? Well, what I didn't realize at the time was my brain was building the bridge work for that, and it took so long. I just kept trying to make it happen faster than it can physically happen. And the other thing that we do is whenever we start off on a path like this, is every time we make a goal, we have this bad habit of attaching a time frame to it. So we decide we want to do something, whether it's in business, whether it's in a personal life, we say I want to do this, and then we come up with this time frame. And in general, we don't have any data that supports how much time it should take. We just set this time in our mind, and then we begin to compare where we are in relationship to that. And then we begin to judge our progress, when none of it is really based on any kind of fact. And an example of this is, I had a woman call me when she was middle-aged. She had changed careers, and she wanted to become a visual artist. And so she asked me if I would work with her because she was struggling. And I said, sure. So she calls me up, and it was not a real long conversation. She said, I said, what's the problem? She said, well, I started my training to be a visual artist 6 months ago, and I'm not as good as I should be. And I said, how good should you be? And there was this silence. She said, I don't know. And I said, well, if you don't know, how do you know you're not better than you should be? And then there's silence. She goes, I never thought of it like that. And I said, well, you're basing it on something, aren't you? I hope. She said, I guess I'm not. And I said, well, let me ask you this. I said, if you could do everything you can do today, 6 months ago when you started, would you have thought you were good? And she said, oh, absolutely. And I said, so it's not that you're not getting better, it's that your perception of what good is changing. And I'm going to leave you with one thing. I worked with a young golfing upstart who had already won in the States in Delaware, and she was trying to get, there was a tournament that was coming up which was a qualifying tournament, and if she won in that and moved up, she would have been playing on a national level. It was very, very important to her. And to me, this is about being too attached to the goal. You have to make your goals, you have to know what your goal is, but then you have to be immersed in the process of achieving the goal, not attached to the moment when you're going to have the goal. So what happened with this girl was she asked me if I would work with her because she said, I have a tendency to self-destruct. Her physical skills were amazing. She said, but if I start to go bad, I really go bad. And she said, no, I just can't seem to get out of that. And she said, so I want to learn how to deal with that situation when everything is going wrong. So, and the purpose of it was for her to place in this tournament. So that was a year before this tournament was going to happen. And she had a picture of the trophy on her desk, and she held it every day, and all this positive reinforcement and affirmations. And so then finally, here comes the tournament. Normally, these kids are not allowed to use a caddy, but in this particular one, they were. So she asked me if I would carry her bag, and I said, sure. Well, I pull up to the golf course, and she's warming up, and I can already see that she has none of the natural ability that she has worked so hard for. She's so afraid of making the wrong swing that she's trying to steer the ball. But I don't want to say anything because that's just going to be more thoughts in her head. So I thought, I'm just going to let this go and see how it comes out. Well, what happened was, she hits her first drive out into the trees, and it just went south. And we got to about the 6th hole, and I mean, she is devastated. She's brokenhearted. Nothing's working. She shot herself out of the tournament. So I thought, well, now's the time to start talking. Because I knew that if I started talking before that, it would have just made it worse. I mean, she was on this path to a train wreck, and there really wasn't much I could do about it, but she could learn from this situation. So I said to her as we're walking after one of her errant shots, I said, why did you ask me to work with you? And she said, because I wanted to learn how to deal with a situation like this. I said, what's the situation? She said, well, a situation where everything is going wrong. And she said, I wanted to be able to turn this around and make it into something that I was in control of. And I said, well, what's going on now? She said, everything's going wrong. She said, I can't fix my swing. I can't hit the ball where I'm aiming. I got a million thoughts running through my head. And I said, well, how do you think you learn to deal with this? And she said, Tom, I don't have the faintest idea. She said, I've tried everything I know. And I said, well, you're missing the obvious. She said, what's that? I said, you have to be in the situation. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's real simple. If you want to learn how to play in the rain, it has to be raining. I said, you can't learn to play in the rain when it's not raining. If you want to learn to play in the wind, it's got to be windy. I said, you said you wanted to learn when nothing was going right. Everything was going wrong. You couldn't find your swing. You weren't coordinated. You were totally devastated. You were brokenhearted, leaking oil, the whole thing. You're there. It's here. So what are you going to do with it? I said, this is actually an opportunity for you to look at how you're reacting to this situation. If you want to turn yourself around, you have to be in this situation. We can sit in Starbucks and make plans and talk about it all you want. I said, but you can't really find out what you're made of, and you can't observe how you're reacting to these situations until you're in the situation. I said, the only thing I've done here is make you aware that you're in the situation. So now, what are you going to do with the situation? Well, in about 2 holes, maybe 3, she completely turned her game around. Now, it wasn't going to change the outcome of that particular round. But she had just broken some state records 2 weeks before that. She told me, walking down the fairway, she said, if I had a choice between the trophies and the records I broke 2 or 3 weeks ago, she said, and what I found about myself today, she said, it's a no-brainer. She said, what I learned today is how to step back, look at the situation unemotionally, and figure out how to turn it around.